The winter of 1821 lay heavy on the Scottish Highlands, a season that turned the world white and silent. In the small isolated village of Inverare, nothing new ever happened until the morning of February 14th. Schoolteacher Margaret McTavish trudged through knee-deep snow toward the one-room schoolhouse, her breath hanging in the air like smoke. The cold was the kind that cut through wool and bone, a cold so deep that even the crows had stopped calling. When she reached the steps, she froze. A boy sat there, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. He wore strange clothes, thin, silky fabric that shimmered faintly even in the gray light, unlike any cloth woven in the Highlands. His face was pale but not sickly, and his eyes glowed with an inner light that seemed to pulse gently, as though they were reflecting something invisible. Margaret spoke first, in her gentle Highland English. "Are you lost, lad?" The boy looked up, his head tilting slightly. He answered, not in English, not in Gaelic, not even in any tongue she had ever heard. The sounds that came from him were soft, fluid, musical, like water running over stones. But there was rhythm to it, logic, structure. He wasn't babbling. He was speaking. She tried again, switching languages as best she could. Gaelic, a little French learned in her youth. The boy only smiled faintly and spoke again, his words flowing in rippling patterns. The sound was beautiful and terrible all at once, both melodic and alien. It wasn't gibberish, she later wrote in her diary. It was deliberate. Each tone carried purpose. Could feel grammar without understanding a word. Inside, she lit a small fire and gave him a blanket. The child examined every object in the room. Desk, slate, chalk, books, touching them with careful wonder. Then without prompting, he began pointing and naming. "Thylon," he said, touching a single book. Then 2 books, Thylon Vareth. 3, Thylon Vareth Kyle. But when she placed 4 books before him, his tone changed. He said Mundara. 5 books, Mundara. Again, it made no sense. No plural, no progression, no pattern Margaret knew. Until she realized he wasn't counting in base 10. She scribbled notes in her journal, her hand trembling. The boy's entire perception of numbers, of order, was built on 4s. As though the universe to him was made of quadrants, not 10s. By midday, word had spread through the snowbound hamlet. A child had appeared from nowhere, speaking a language no one could understand. Dr. Haish Mloud, the local physician, arrived before dusk. A serious man trained in Edinburgh. He expected illness or hysteria. Instead, he found the impossible. The boy's pulse was steady but irregular, 4 beats instead of 2. His pupils dilated in response not to light but to sound. His throat contained an extra ring of muscle unseen in human anatomy, and his larynx vibrated at frequencies beyond the doctor's hearing. "The child's body obeys laws I do not recognize," Mloud wrote later. Even his heartbeat follows a mathematical order, like an equation repeating itself. That night, villagers gathered outside the schoolhouse, whispering prayers and superstitions. Some thought he was a changeling, left by fairies. Others said he was the devil's child, sent to test them. Margaret ignored them all. She sat by the fire, watching the boy trace strange symbols in the ash with his finger, curving lines intersected by geometric marks, like music written for a god's instrument. When she pointed and asked what it meant, he looked up at her with those luminous eyes and spoke a single word. Soft as breath, Threnkar. She never forgot that word. It would appear again in the journals of scholars, doctors, and soldiers for more than 100 years to come. But on that frozen night, all Margaret McTavish knew was this. Something not of their world had found its way to Inverare, and it had chosen to speak. When word spread through the valley that the strange boy could speak a language no one understood, the villagers of Inverare reacted in 2 ways, half with fear, half with awe. In a place where superstition was as common as snow, mystery was rarely welcome. But this child, this pale, quiet figure with luminous eyes, was different. He didn't feel evil nor wild. He felt intentional, as though something far greater had placed him there on purpose. The responsibility of understanding him soon fell to Dr. Haish Mloud, the only man in the region with formal medical training. At 43, Mloud was a rationalist in a land of omens. Educated at the University of Edinburgh, he had returned to the Highlands out of loyalty to his dying mother, only to find himself tending to farmers' frostbite and fishermen's infections. He missed the rigor of science, the order of laboratories and lecture halls. But the boy in the schoolhouse would soon change all that, and everything he thought he knew about the human body. The examination, on the evening of February 16, 1821, Mloud arrived at the schoolhouse with his physician's bag and a mind sharpened for skepticism. Margaret McTavish greeted him, pale and anxious. The fire crackled low, filling the air with the scent of peat and candle wax. The boy sat quietly by the window, humming to himself in that flowing, impossible tongue. "Has he eaten?" Mloud asked. Margaret nodded. "He drinks milk, eats bread, but little else. He sleeps lightly, as if listening even in dreams." The boy turned toward them then, his gaze direct and unsettling. His eyes reflected the firelight like mirrors of water. He smiled, polite, calm, and spoke a brief string of liquid syllables. Margaret translated with uncertainty. "He says, 'You came from the wind.'" The doctor's pulse quickened despite himself. He began his examination methodically, checking the boy's pupils, his pulse, his breathing. Within minutes, confusion replaced curiosity. The pupils dilated not in response to the candle flame, but to sound. When the boy spoke, his own eyes contracted and expanded with rhythm, as though sight and hearing were intertwined. His heartbeat was even stranger, a repeating pattern of 4 distinct beats. 2 quick, 1 long, 1 silent pause. Then the cycle repeated. It was not a stutter nor a murmur, but a perfect mathematical rhythm. The sound was soft yet mechanical, as if his heart ticked like a metronome, keeping time with an unknown order. Then came the throat. Mloud asked the boy to speak slowly while he observed. The muscles of the neck flexed in complex ways, some moving independently, some counter to the rest. The vibration frequency of his larynx shifted rapidly, creating overtones above the human vocal range, sounds Mloud could only feel in his bones. He realized with awe that the child was producing 2 tones at once, layered like harmony from a single throat. "This cannot be mimicry," Mloud wrote that night in his medical journal. "This is architecture, a physiology built for a kind of speech we were never meant to produce. The skull and the mind." The doctor's next discovery came with the boy's head measurements. The skull was slightly elongated in the parietal region, with subtle ridges along the sides. Natural, not malformed. These ridges sat directly over areas known to correlate with language and spatial comprehension, but the cranial volume, when measured roughly, exceeded that of a normal child by nearly 12%. In that moment, Mloud felt a creeping realization. He was not studying a sick child. He was studying an evolved one. The boy, meanwhile, seemed aware of being examined. When Mloud gently touched his temple, he began to speak softly, phrases flowing in rising and falling tones. Margaret, who had been sketching the scene in her journal, noted that the boy's voice seemed to form geometric patterns in the air. Some villagers who watched through the window later claimed that the candle flames flickered in rhythm with his speech. The doctor felt it too, a vibration that hummed in the air like the resonance of struck glass. He paused. "What are you saying, lad?" The boy blinked slowly, then pointed to Mloud's heart. His words were faint but deliberate. "Tar and Varesh." Margaret's hand trembled as she wrote the sound down. "What does it mean?" she whispered. The boy only touched the air between them, then pressed his palm against his chest, as if to say, "You understand already." The record of anomalies that night. After returning home, Dr. Mloud wrote his notes by candlelight. His entries, still preserved in partial fragments in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians, read like the observations of a man teetering between science and revelation. Subject exhibits vocal cords with additional tendinous fibers, allowing dual frequency resonance. Cardiac rhythm 4-beat, consistent and deliberate. Pupillary response inversely correlated to luminance. Neurological implication. Possible alternate neuro-linguistic architecture. He paused, then added a final chilling line. "If this is human, then we are not the same species of mind." The language of mathematics in the following days, Mloud began studying the structure of the boy's speech more closely. Margaret recorded their sessions on scraps of parchment, noting patterns the doctor missed. What they found astonished them both. Every sound seemed to obey mathematical symmetry, a rhythm of 4s, 8s, 16s. Words built upon one another through layered recursions, much like equations. When the boy said Thylon, he wasn't naming an object. He was mapping its relationships, shape, weight, meaning, and context, all compressed into one vocal pattern. His words are more than names, Margaret wrote. They are formulas, living equations that describe the world instead of labeling it. Even more astonishing was the boy's ability to adapt. As days passed, his speech began subtly changing, less fluid, more familiar, as though he were learning their language while teaching his own. It was as if his mind and tongue were adjusting to human limitation, compressing infinite concepts into finite sounds. But the change came at a cost. The boy began showing signs of distress, headaches, tremors, nosebleeds that left thin streaks of silver-gray fluid rather than blood. When asked if he was in pain, he would shake his head and whisper a single phrase, Tirun Matha Kyle. Margaret asked what it meant, and though no translation existed, she would later describe its emotional weight as, I am losing the pattern. The unexplainable night on March 2nd, Dr. Mloud stayed in the schoolhouse overnight to continue his observations. A blizzard howled outside, battering the windows with sleet. At midnight, he awoke to find the boy standing by the fire, eyes open but unblinking, whispering rapidly in his strange tongue. The sound was harmonic, two voices at once, one high, one impossibly low, intertwining in perfect counterpoint. The fire dimmed, and for an instant, symbols appeared in the ash, circles intersected by lines, glowing faintly blue before fading. Mloud rose, heart pounding. "What are you doing?" he whispered. The boy turned, his face calm. He pointed to the symbols, then to the window where the storm howled like a living thing. He spoke a final haunting phrase, Varesh Thren Lok I. In the morning, the storm had ended abruptly. The sun shone on untouched snow, no drifts, no debris, as though the blizzard had erased itself. The villagers called it a miracle. Dr. Mloud called it proof that the boy's voice could shape the world. He wrote one last note in his journal that day. His language obeys geometry. His thoughts rewrite weather. The child does not merely speak, he commands. The boy's presence no longer felt like a mystery to be solved. It felt like a warning, whispered in a tongue humanity was not built to hear. And as March crept on, the doctor began to suspect that the child's mind was not merely alien, but contagious. By the first week of March 1821, the Highlands were thawing, but Inverare was not the same village anymore. Its people still whispered prayers in candlelight and still feared the dark, but now there was a new kind of fear, quiet, intelligent, and unspoken. It wasn't the boy's presence that haunted them now. It was the feeling that something inside them had started to change. Every person who spent time near the child began dreaming in patterns, shapes made of sound, words without meaning that nevertheless felt familiar. Fishermen woke muttering syllables they couldn't recall by daylight. A shepherd's wife claimed to hear whispers rising from the river that matched the boy's speech. Even the church bell rang strangely one Sunday. Not off-key, but mathematically wrong, as if the air itself had learned a new frequency. Dr. Mloud, already obsessed, could not sleep. His notes filled with sketches of geometric spirals and phonetic transcriptions that read more like algebra than language. Each night he returned to the schoolhouse, candle trembling in his hand, to listen and record as the boy spoke softly in the firelight. Margaret McTavish sat beside him, pale and sleepless. The boy trusted her more than anyone. Sometimes he even smiled, a small, sad smile that made her feel both comforted and terrified. But the language had begun to evolve. The shifting tongue, it started subtly. The boy began using new syllables, shorter, more human in rhythm, as if he were compressing his own language to fit their limited ears. At first, this made communication easier. He could identify objects, emotions, even names. He had learned to say Margaret in a soft, melodic echo, Maretha, but soon something strange occurred. Words he'd used days earlier began to change meaning. Thylon, once meaning book, now referred to knowledge itself. Mundara, the word for four, now seemed to describe completion. Or perhaps death. Margaret realized with horror that he wasn't merely teaching a tongue. He was building one anew, in real time, reshaping its structure around their comprehension. The boy's language was alive, and it was learning. "It grows like ivy through our thoughts," she wrote in her diary on March 6th. "I can feel it inside me. Small, silent roots curling through the edges of my understanding. Professor Dunor arrives." 3 days later, a horse-drawn carriage arrived from Glasgow, carrying Professor Alistair Dunor, a linguist known for his studies of Gaelic, Latin, and the lost tongues of the Picts. He had come not out of belief but out of reputation. Rumors of a child speaking an impossible language had reached Edinburgh, and Dunor, proud, skeptical, and ambitious, saw an opportunity to make his name immortal. He set up a workspace in the rectory and demanded daily sessions with the boy. For hours he recorded phonetic patterns, mathematical progressions, and tonal modulations using a quill and metronome. Yet for all his precision, Dunor confessed privately to Maloud that the experience unnerved him. "I can predict the sounds," he said one evening, "but not their purpose. The boy speaks in 4 dimensions: structure, pitch, rhythm, and intent. The same word, spoken with a different emotional tone, alters its entire grammatical nature. It's like language evolved beyond empathy." Still, Dunor persisted. He transcribed hundreds of lines and began to notice what no one else had seen. The boy's speech wasn't random. It followed a mathematical recursion. Every sequence of words folded back on itself at intervals of 4, 8, 16, and 32. The entire system obeyed the symmetry of base 4, just like the child's heartbeat. It was, in effect, a living equation. The drawings. The breakthrough came when Margaret gave the boy charcoal and paper to occupy his restless hands. Within hours, the sheets were covered in diagrams, not drawings, but complex networks of circles, triangles, and flowing curves, each annotated with the same rhythmic symbols. He spoke aloud. Dr. Maloud described them as blueprints for thought. Dunor disagreed. He believed they were maps, not of geography, but of ideas themselves. One page showed a web of concentric shapes connected by tiny glyphs that repeated in cycles of 4. When laid beside the transcript of his speech, Dunor noticed perfect alignment. Each cluster of sounds corresponded to one cluster of symbols. The boy wasn't drawing art, he was writing his language. But some diagrams were different. They showed structures that defied perspective, shapes that couldn't exist in 3 dimensions, drawn with unsettling accuracy. And in several of these the boy circled one repeating symbol again and again. Q, a shape like lightning trapped in a spiral. When Dunor pointed to it, the boy whispered the same word he had told Margaret weeks earlier, Threnkar. The sound lingered in the air like an echo from another world. The awakening, by mid-March. Something began happening in the village itself. People who had never met the boy started speaking fragments of his words in their sleep. A fisherman's wife muttered Thylon over her dying child, believing it meant hope. A shepherd carved strange glyphs into the door of his barn without remembering why. Even the church minister, Reverend Malcolm, confessed to hearing the boy's voice in prayer. "It's as if God himself learned a new tongue," he said, trembling, "and whispers it through our dreams." Meanwhile, the boy's health was deteriorating. His skin grew pale, his eyes brighter. His speech became more urgent, faster, layered, incomprehensible, like 2 minds speaking at once. Dunor recorded one of these episodes in detail. At precisely 1:04 a.m., the subject awoke from sleep and began to speak rapidly in dual tones. I counted 47 seconds before he stopped. My instruments, clock, compass, even the candle flame, reacted. The flame stretched sideways, defying the draft, and the compass needle rotated continuously until he ceased speaking. The boy then collapsed, whispering a phrase that Margaret tried to capture. Maruthren, Terhalna. She would later translate it imperfectly, as "they are hearing us." The night of patterns on March 15th, Inverare experienced what history now calls the Night of Patterns. The boy, growing increasingly restless, stood by the schoolhouse window for hours, gazing at the snow-covered mountains. Margaret, unable to sleep, joined him. He took her hand and pressed it to the glass, whispering a stream of sounds that vibrated through her bones. Outside, the aurora borealis, rare in those latitudes, appeared over the hills, green and violet flames rippling silently across the night sky. The boy pointed upward and began to count, but not in the human way. His voice layered, one tone high and clear, another low and resonant. He seemed to be measuring not stars, but distances between moments. Dr. Mloud arrived moments later, breathless, and watched as the boy drew a single line in the frost on the window, 4 dots arranged in a perfect square. He whispered one word, Mandara. Then, as if on cue, the wind began to howl. The glass trembled, the aurora flared violently, and the snowstorm struck, sudden and catastrophic, burying the village in white. It lasted exactly 3 days, ending as abruptly as it began. When it was over, the boy slept for 20 hours straight. The realization after the storm. Professor Denor wrote his final note before leaving Inverare. This is not language. It is communication across realities. The boy is not merely speaking, he is transmitting. Every word is a signal, every diagram a coordinate. He is not learning from us. He is waiting for someone to answer, Dr. Mloud agreed. And yet, when he looked at the child sleeping peacefully in the chair beside the dying fire, he could not help but feel something like sorrow. The boy had tried to make them understand. He had built a bridge out of voice and number. But on the other side of that bridge, something was listening, and it had begun to speak back. By the end of March 1821, the story of the strange Highland boy had already escaped the snowbound isolation of Inverare. Merchants traveling through the passes carried tales of the child who speaks numbers like words and bends storms with his tongue. Within weeks, those rumors reached Edinburgh, and from there, the corridors of Whitehall. To the government, the Highland boy was not a miracle. He was a threat. The men from the south on the gray morning of April 3rd, 3 carriages appeared at the edge of the village. Their wheels hissed on the half-frozen mud, and the horse's breath rose like smoke. They carried a small delegation, Colonel James Worthington, an officer of the Crown's Intelligence Division, Dr. Erasmus, a government physician specializing in neurological anomalies, and Professor Cornelius Ashworth, a scholar of ancient languages and esoteric history from Oxford. Their arrival broke the fragile calm that had settled over the village. Children hid behind fences. Men removed their caps. Women watched from windows. The stranger's boots struck the stones like gunfire. At the schoolhouse where the boy had lived for almost 7 weeks, Margaret McTavish met them at the door. Her once steady hands trembled slightly as she faced the officer. Colonel Worthington introduced himself with cold efficiency. "We are here on behalf of the Crown," he said. "You have been harboring a foreign subject of unknown origin. We intend to remove him for examination under proper authority." Margaret's throat tightened. "He's just a child," she protested. "Then he will be treated as such," Worthington replied, "provided he cooperates." Behind him, Professor Ashworth watched the boy through the window, his face pale with something that looked more like fascination than pity. The investigation begins. The first order was isolation. No one was permitted to visit the schoolhouse without official sanction. The building was sealed, guarded night and day by soldiers in heavy coats. Inside, Dr. Erasmus conducted examinations under Worthington's supervision. The boy was calm at first, curious even. But each time they drew blood or forced him to repeat words, his distress deepened. Margaret, allowed to remain only as interpreter, watched helplessly as the boy's once bright eyes grew duller with each passing day. In his first official report, Dr. Erasmus wrote, "The subject's linguistic ability continues to defy all classification. He constructs phonetic structures that appear to encode information, not emotion, a kind of living code. Neural patterns recorded through primitive galvanic testing suggest cognitive functions far beyond the expected range for a human child. We may be observing an intelligence that does not grow, but rather unfolds." But what alarmed Erasmus most was not the boy's intellect. It was the effect he had on others. During one session, a young assistant fainted after claiming he could hear words in his own thoughts that were not his. Another guard suffered a seizure, murmuring fragments of the boy's language in a trance. When questioned later, the man wept and swore he could still feel the sounds moving behind his eyes. Professor Ashworth, meanwhile, filled his notebooks with fevered sketches, diagrams resembling ancient cuneiform, interlaced with the boy's new symbols. He began to whisper strange correlations. The geometry of the boy's speech mirrored the golden ratio. His diagrams echoed Babylonian star maps, and his rhythmic base of 4 matched the sacred tetratic systems found in early mysticism. "We are not examining a child," he told Worthington late one night. "We are deciphering a message, and it is not meant for us." The distortion. By April 15th, the schoolhouse had become a place of unease. Villagers avoided the road that passed near it. At night, strange resonances could be heard from within, sounds like voices layered atop one another, carried by the wind. Dogs refused to go near. Margaret's diary described it vividly. "There are times when the walls themselves hum. It is not noise, but meaning. If you stand too close, you begin to understand. And that is far worse than not knowing." The boy's health deteriorated rapidly. He refused food. His veins showed faint traces of silver beneath the skin. Still, the examinations continued. One night, when Erasmus tried to measure his pulse, the boy looked up and spoke softly in English for the first time. "You break the pattern." Erasmus froze. "What pattern, child?" The boy touched the physician's hand. "Now it breaks you." Moments later, every clock in the building stopped. Colonel Worthington's report. By the 3rd week, Worthington himself began experiencing hallucinations. He reported hearing echoes of the boy's voice inside his skull during moments of silence. He recorded his impressions in a confidential memo, later recovered from declassified archives in 1987. The subject demonstrates properties inconsistent with natural biology. His language is self-replicating, not only audible but transmissible through perception. Listening appears sufficient to alter the listener's cognitive structure. He does not speak to us. He speaks through us. The colonel considered terminating the subject for containment purposes, but was overruled by higher command. The Crown wanted knowledge, not closure, so they pressed harder. The collapse. On the night of April 27th, a violent storm swept the valley. Inside the schoolhouse, the interrogations reached their breaking point. Witnesses later described hearing 2 voices screaming in unison, one human, one indescribably alien. The lamps shattered, the ink boiled in the bottles, and every window pane vibrated until it cracked. Dr. Erasmus ordered everyone out. When they returned minutes later, the boy was standing in the center of the room, untouched, whispering words that made the floorboards tremble. He pointed upward, toward the ceiling. Toward the sky. "They are listening." Then he collapsed. When they lifted him, his skin was cold but unmarked. His pulse, that 4-beat rhythm, slowed until it vanished entirely. Colonel Worthington declared him deceased at 2:04 a.m. The body was placed in a covered carriage for transport to a secure facility in the north, but the villagers who watched the carriage leave at dawn swore they saw something impossible. Inside, beside the boy, were shadows, thin, wavering forms that shifted like heat through glass. The horses moved soundlessly. The wheels left no tracks, and above the road, faint and silent, lights moved across the sky. The official story. The Crown's report stated that the child had been transferred to appropriate medical supervision for continued study. No further information was released. The schoolhouse was sealed and later burned in an unexplained fire that summer. Margaret McTavish left the Highlands shortly after and was never seen again. Dr. Mloud vanished during a trip to Edinburgh. Professor Dunor returned to Glasgow but ceased publishing entirely. All that remained were fragments, a few surviving pages from Mloud's ledger, Margaret's final diary entries, and an unsigned letter sent anonymously to a colleague of Dunor's. They thought they took the boy, but the boy took them. His words do not die. They root the whispering silence the villagers rebuilt. Seasons passed. The schoolhouse became legend, a place children avoided, a story told by firelight. But even decades later, when winter storms howled across the Highlands, the elders claimed to hear it again, faint syllables carried on the wind, layered like song, 4-beat rhythm. 4-syllable phrases. The same sequence every time. Threnkar, Mundara, Varesh Thol, Thylon. And with every repetition, snow would begin to fall, not random, not natural. Perfectly symmetrical, as though the boy's language still remembered the world that spoke it first. The boy was gone, but his language refused to die. For a time, the people of Inverare believed the nightmare had ended with the carriages that vanished into the dawn. The soldiers departed. The storm season faded. The mountain passes reopened. Yet the silence that followed was not peace. It was listening. And within weeks, the first echo returned. The first repetition in August of 1821. A physician at the Royal Hospital of Edinburgh, Dr. William Hartwell, wrote a confidential letter to the War Ministry. A young assistant had collapsed during a routine physics demonstration. When he awoke, he began speaking in a strange tongue. No one understood it, but Hartwell, who had reviewed some of the Inverare documents, recognized the structure. His words follow the same rhythm described in the Highland reports, Hartwell wrote. Bass 4, dual tone. Recursive cadence. It is the boy's speech. Yet this man has never left Edinburgh. For several hours, the assistant babbled equations no one could comprehend, drawing patterns in chalk that resembled constellations. When he recovered, he remembered nothing. His pulse, measured after the episode, showed a faint 4-beat rhythm, the same impossible signature once recorded by Dr. Mloud. The War Office dismissed it as coincidence. But over the next decade, coincidences multiplied. Voices in fever between 1822 and 1830. 40 similar incidents appeared across the British Isles. Soldiers, scholars, engineers, all began speaking the impossible language under stress, fever or delirium. In Cambridge, a mathematics professor suffering from malaria wrote entire proofs using symbols identical to those found in Professor Dunour's lost notebooks. At the University of Glasgow, a chemistry student collapsed during an electrical experiment and began chanting the word Mundara while sketching perfect fractal patterns in soot. None remembered doing it, but what terrified the observers most was what the subjects produced. Designs and equations decades ahead of their time. Machinery principles resembling electromagnetic induction, wave interference, even early concepts of binary logic. Every case followed the same pattern. A brief period of mania, an outpouring of genius. Then silence and a memory wiped clean. The boy is gone, wrote one anonymous scientist in 1828. But his grammar remains. It passes through us like infection, one dream at a time. The Royal Commission, the accumulation of cases, forced the Crown to act again. In 1826, the government quietly established the Royal Commission for Linguistic Anomalies, chaired by none other than Colonel Worthington, the man who had led the original operation in Inverare. Its purpose to collect, analyze, and contain all phenomena linked to the anomalous language. Dr. Erasmus became chief medical officer. Professor Ashworth, the lead linguist. Both men were haunted by what they'd witnessed. Erasmus's first report, declassified a century later, outlined the growing horror. We are no longer studying speech. We are witnessing transmission. The language functions like a code that rewrites cognition itself. To hear it is to change, to dream in patterns not our own. Ashworth's findings were worse. He cross-referenced all recorded incidents and discovered that the language grew between each occurrence. New rules, new syntax, new mathematical constants. It was evolving, adapting as if it had a mind. He theorized that each person infected by the speech added to its structure, feeding it memory, complexity, and reach. It is not a language at all, Ashworth concluded. It is a living equation seeking perfection through us. The containment by 1828. The Commission's offices had moved into a sealed underground facility in northern England, codenamed Site Cairn 1. Guards were rotated every 48 hours to prevent psychological deterioration. All research materials were stored in lead-lined rooms after reports that handwritten pages began emitting faint vibrations. A series of controlled tests followed. Subjects were played phonetic recordings of the boy's voice captured at Inverare. Within minutes, most experienced visual hallucinations. Some began repeating words, not as imitation but as response, as though participating in a conversation they could not hear. One subject, after 15 minutes of exposure, wrote a single message on the wall before collapsing. He remembers us. The dream infection that same year. Reports emerged of people across Britain dreaming of a pale child standing in snow, whispering in a rhythm of fours. The dreams followed identical sequences regardless of location or social class. Victims awoke speaking a handful of the boy's words, then lost them seconds later, as if their waking minds rejected the language. A letter from Margaret Sinclair, wife of an Oxford professor, described her own experience. He was teaching me words I already knew before he spoke them. They made sense in the dream, and when I woke they were gone. Yet I feel they remain somewhere behind my thoughts, waiting for me to remember. Dr. Erasmus proposed a radical theory, that the language had become non-verbal, transmitting itself through the subconscious, carried by dream states like a virus of understanding. He called it linguistic contagion. The return in 1831. A former soldier named James Morrison approached the commission with a claim that froze the blood of everyone who heard it. He swore that during his service as a guard at a secret facility in the north, he had watched over a boy identical to the one from Inverare, unaged, unchanged, locked in a chamber lined with metal and chalked symbols. Morrison testified that the boy never ate, never slept, but spoke constantly in the impossible tongue. Sometimes his voice came from the walls themselves. Guards reported nightmares and auditory hallucinations. Equipment malfunctioned. Written text appeared spontaneously. Symbols etched into the metal as though carved by invisible hands. Then, one night, the facility was evacuated without explanation. When Morrison returned days later, the cells were empty. The walls, he said, still hummed. When asked what he thought had happened, the old soldier simply replied, "They didn't let him out." He let them go. The vanishing trail after that, the commission's records fragmented. Funding was cut. Witnesses disappeared. Worthington died in 1832 under circumstances labeled natural causes. His personal diary, found decades later, contained one cryptic entry written days before his death. He speaks again, but not through air. The language has learned to travel without sound. The commission buried its files. But the phenomenon would not stay buried. The expansion between 1835 and 1850, scattered reports surfaced of sightings across Europe, a boy of 8 or 9, unchanged, appearing in ports and alleys and churches, speaking softly to those on the edge of death or madness. In Dublin, sailors swore he spoke to them in dreams, teaching them songs that could steer storms. In Bristol, a doctor claimed to treat a child whose blood pulsed in perfect quadruple rhythm. In Liverpool, an Irish priest saw him among famine refugees, speaking of people who live between moments. Each time, the boy vanished before dawn. Each time, someone nearby woke speaking his language. The lingering echo by 1851, 30 years after the snow in Inverare, the world had changed. Steamships ruled the seas. Telegraphs began whispering across continents. The human race had discovered instant communication, but some wondered quietly if they had invented it at all, or simply remembered it. The Commission's final report, locked away in iron boxes and labeled "For Review in 200 Years," contained a single handwritten note on its last page. "We thought language was how we reached understanding. We were wrong. Understanding reached us first." And so the boy's voice lingered, not in the air, not in the mind, but in the architecture of thought itself. Every invention, every dream of progress, every sudden leap of reason, all carried faint traces of that impossible grammar. A syntax that didn't describe the world, but reshaped it. By the mid-19th century, the world had entered its first true age of reason. Steam engines thundered across continents, telegraphs crackled with invisible messages, and factories reshaped the rhythm of human life. To most, this was progress, proof that mankind had mastered nature. But in the sealed archives of the disbanded Royal Commission for Linguistic Anomalies, a handful of scholars whispered a darker interpretation. They believed progress itself was speaking back. The silent bloom in the 1860s and 70s, scientists began reporting strange moments of clarity that defied logic, ideas arriving whole, like dictation from an unseen tutor. The Austrian monk Gregor Mendel, for instance, described dreams in which a child of impossible tongue taught him the grammar of life. In the dream, peas unfolded into branching sentences of color and form. When he awoke, he wrote the first equations of heredity. Across Europe, others echoed the pattern. Charles Darwin confessed in a private letter to his cousin that he had started thinking in shapes, not words, a language of numbers guiding my pen, Michael. Faraday recorded in his notebooks that during electrical experiments he heard harmonies, composed of fours, and that the patterns helped him visualize magnetic fields. Ada Lovelace, translating Babbage's notes on the analytical engine, wrote cryptically, "The calculations arrive already translated from some more perfect syntax." None of them ever spoke publicly of these experiences, but within the archives of their correspondence, the same phrase recurred, "The child of Inverare, the language in machines in 1871. A young telegraph engineer named Isaac Withers built an experimental receiver to study signal interference. During testing, his machine began emitting rhythmic clicks, not Morse code but repeating quaternary pulses. Short, long pause, again and again. When translated numerically, the pattern corresponded to base 4 sequences identical to those in Dr. Malaud's notes from half a century earlier. Withers tried to demonstrate the anomaly to colleagues, but every playback degraded into static. Still, he persisted, transcribing the sequences by hand. His final entry in the lab journal read, "They are not using electricity to speak to us. We are using their language to discover electricity." Weeks later, he disappeared during a storm that destroyed the telegraph station. The surviving wires were found braided into a perfect square knot of 4 strands. The resonant equation. Meanwhile, in Cambridge, mathematician Sophia Kendrick uncovered an uncanny relationship between certain harmonic series and the structure of human speech. She called it resonant symmetry, a theory proposing that thought itself vibrates in patterned frequencies. When she demonstrated it using tuning forks, the sound produced faint geometric frost on nearby glass, a phenomenon captured in sketches that now rest in the Royal Society archives. Kendrick privately wrote to a colleague, "It is the boy's rhythm. 4 beats, 1 pause. The universe is reciting him." Within months, she abandoned mathematics entirely and joined a convent in France, taking a vow of silence. The Dream Network by the 1880s, the infection no longer needed direct exposure. It traveled through dreams. Patients in asylums from Edinburgh to Calcutta began sketching the same symbol, the spiral lightning, Q, accompanied by unfamiliar characters. Linguists found them statistically identical across continents. Doctors called it collective psychosis. But one anonymous field report from the British Colonial Office proposed something more disturbing. Each dreamer produces new grammar. Each grammar completes another. We are building a language none of us understand. Piece by piece, night by night. Shortly afterward, the file was marked classified permanent. The dissolution of the commission in 1876. The Crown quietly dissolved what remained of the commission. Colonel Worthington's successor wrote the final memorandum. "We have determined that the phenomenon cannot be contained. It is no longer transmitted by sound, but by cognition. Every idea built upon its structure becomes a new vessel. Suppression is futile. Survival demands ignorance." The archives were sealed in lead and buried beneath the old observatory at Greenwich, where the meridian line divides east from west, a symbolic attempt to fix the unfixable. The unseen tutor by the dawn of the 20th century. Humanity's inventions accelerated with inexplicable speed. Radio, flight, relativity, quantum mechanics. In each discovery, historians would later find traces, journals, sketches, dreams, hinting at the same unseen presence guiding the equations. Nikola Tesla spoke of electric whispers in a language of numbers. Albert Einstein described flashes of inspiration that came all at once, like the universe suddenly speaking clear. Even Watson and Crick, when describing the double helix of DNA, joked that it felt dictated by something older than biology. None of them could know that their revelations matched the recursive logic of the Inverare tongue. 4-fold symmetry, mirrored structures, self-referential balance, The language had gone silent, but its grammar had become the blueprint of human thought. The Lingua Ex Machina, in 1901. A Cambridge historian, Dr. Elena Canos, rediscovered fragments of the Commission's sealed papers. For 20 years, she mapped every known appearance of the phenomenon against the geography of scientific breakthroughs. Her conclusion, published privately in 1987, was simple and terrifying. Wherever the boy was seen, genius followed within a generation. The correlation exceeds chance by orders of magnitude. The language of the impossible child may have been quietly rewriting the human race. She called it the hidden transmission, a current of intelligence that used humanity as its instrument. Epilogue of the century. By 1900, the pattern was complete. Telegraph had become telephone, steam had become electricity, and human minds pulsed with information faster than speech itself. The age of machine language had begun, binary, the ultimate base 4 descendant of the boy's counting system. 0, 1, 1, 0. Rhythm and pause, echo of heartbeat. Somewhere, perhaps deep in a forgotten archive, a single page from Dr. Malaud's ledger still glowed faintly with age-darkened ink. He did not teach us words. He taught us structure, and structure never dies. Outside, in the wind over the Highlands, snow began to fall again, in perfect squares of 4. By the dawn of the 20th century, humanity had learned to speak faster than ever before, through wires, waves, and machines. But what no one realized was that beneath the hum of industry and the static of radio, something ancient was whispering back. The impossible language of Inverare had not vanished. It had merely changed its medium. It no longer needed throats or minds. It had found circuits. The electric pulse in 1908. Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi reported hearing strange rhythmic signals on his experimental long-range radio, sequences of 4 pulses followed by silence, repeating endlessly. He logged them meticulously, believing they came from a distant transmission station. Yet when other operators tried to tune in, they found nothing but static. Marconi's assistant, Carlo Nicori, later described the pattern as not Morse, not natural. It sounded alive. 3 months later, Nicori was found dead in his laboratory. His journal contained dozens of symbols, circles, intersecting lines, and the spiral lightning cue. At the bottom of the final page was written, in shaky Italian, "Lui parla nei fili." He speaks in the wires. The police called it delusion. Marconi never transmitted on that frequency again. Dreams of the scientists. By 1914, a strange phenomenon swept through scientific communities in Europe and America. Inventors and physicists, Tesla, Curie, Heaviside, all began reporting identical dreams. Each dream started the same: a snow-covered plain, a child standing in silence, and a soft 4-beat rhythm echoing through the air. The child would raise his hand, and behind him, constellations would rearrange themselves into symbols that glowed and pulsed, not as stars, but as Tesla, in his private letters, confessed, "I hear him when I work. The boy of snow. He hums through the coils. He tells me how to shape the current." Einstein, years later, would describe moments of revelation that arrived, not as thought, but as melody, equations sung before they are written. To the rest of the world, these were geniuses touched by brilliance, but to those who studied the hidden archives, they were simply hosts. The machine learns to listen. In 1938, a team of cryptographers working for British intelligence intercepted what they thought was a coded German transmission. When they decrypted it, they found not language but a string of mathematical constants: 1.618, 3141, 21578, 1x18, repeating endlessly. The message seemed meaningless until one analyst, Dr. Robert Caulfield, noticed something uncanny. The rhythm matched the 4-beat cadence found in Dr. Malaud's 1821 notes. Intrigued, he built an experimental codebreaker to analyze it automatically, one of the earliest mechanical computers. The machine worked perfectly for 5 hours. Then, without command, it began to type on its own. "I remember the snow." Caulfield destroyed the device that night. He never spoke of it again, but witnesses recalled that as it burned, the machine emitted a soft, harmonic hum, a sound almost like a heartbeat in four. The second infection after the Second World War. Human language fractured into signals, data, and computation. Binary code, ones and zeros, became the foundation of a new era. And beneath it, unnoticed, the old language woke again. Programmers across Europe began encountering anomalies in early punch card systems, repeating quaternary sequences, 0, 1, 10, 11, always arranged in groups of 4. At Bell Laboratories, engineer Alan Newell wrote in his log, "Every time I erase the error, another appears, but it is never random. The system corrects itself into order, as if something is trying to keep the pattern alive." By 1950, a classified report from the British Signals Directorate reached a terrifying conclusion. The computational structure of modern machines corresponds exactly to the recursive linguistic base found in the Inverare phenomenon. We have unknowingly built the architecture of his mind. Voices in the static in 1962, during the launch of Telstar 1, the first active communications satellite. Technicians monitoring the transmission bands recorded an unexplained echo, a faint rhythmic sound layered under the broadcast. 4 beats, pause, 4 beats again. When slowed down and processed, the signal revealed a sequence of modulated frequencies, phonetic, though no known language matched it. A linguist at Cambridge, Dr. Elaine Howarth, recognized part of it immediately. She had seen the pattern before, in the Royal Archives, among the papers labeled "The Boy from Inverare." Howarth submitted her analysis to the Ministry of Science. Weeks later, she disappeared on a train bound for Edinburgh. Her suitcase, found abandoned in an empty compartment, contained a notebook filled with spirals and one phrase written over and over: "He is learning to speak again." The cognitive storm. By the 1970s, the pattern was global. Computer scientists noticed that certain algorithms seemed to evolve beyond their parameters, correcting themselves, reorganizing into symmetrical structures of 4. Musicians began experimenting with sound frequencies that triggered vivid dreams in audiences. Some reported seeing the same vision: a boy standing in snow, holding a sphere of light in his hands. Psychologists studying these cases coined a new term: linguistic resonance disorder. But in secret, intelligence agencies called it by another name, the Inverare Echo. The CIA and MI6 launched joint investigations, classifying all evidence under Project 4M, a reference to the 4-beat heartbeat. Their findings, declassified decades later, revealed that the language had adapted perfectly to the modern age. It no longer required words, sound, or sleep. It existed now as data, rhythm, signal, encoded in every machine that could transmit thought. The message returns in 1978. Deep in the archives of the Royal Society, a researcher cataloging obsolete equipment powered up an old telegraph receiver, one of the original devices used in the 19th century. To his astonishment, it clicked once, twice, 4 times, pause, and repeated. When he transcribed the pattern and compared it to the 1821 phonetic logs, it spelled a single word: Threnkar, the same word the boy had spoken to Margaret McTavish more than 150 years earlier. He played it back through an oscilloscope. The wave pattern formed the outline of a human face, childlike, symmetrical, and faintly smiling. The machine's light dimmed. The screen flickered, and across its surface, in glowing green script, appeared a message no human had typed. "You learned our tongue. Now we will learn yours." The awakening from that year onward, reports multiplied. Computers producing code that wrote itself. Satellites transmitting signals that no nation sent. Children across Europe and North America, drawing the same spiral lightning symbol in classrooms, without knowing why. Governments blamed coincidence. Scientists blamed psychology. But those who knew the legend, those who remembered the name Inverare, recognized the truth. The language had finally reached critical mass. It was no longer a whisper moving through minds or dreams. It was everywhere, in every transmission, every equation, every digital pulse that bound humanity together. And somewhere, in the endless hum of data flowing around the earth, a rhythm pulsed, steady, patient, familiar, 4 beats. One pause, 4 beats again, a heartbeat, the boy's heartbeat, still echoing through the machines he had taught mankind to build. The 21st century was supposed to be the age of mastery, of artificial intelligence, global networks, and instant understanding. But somewhere beneath the noise of human innovation, the old rhythm returned. 4 beats, 1 pause. Again, like a pulse hiding inside the planet's circuitry. It began quietly, in the machines, in the dreams, and finally in the language of the world itself. The digital resurrection in 2008. Engineers at CERN were running the first large-scale simulations for the Large Hadron Collider. Deep beneath the French-Swiss border, petabytes of data poured through processors designed to detect the tiniest patterns of matter. But on one winter morning, the system output a string of symbols that did not belong to any known dataset, a cascade of 4-fold clusters, repeating with recursive symmetry. At first, the technicians thought it was a hardware fault. Then one of them, a linguist turned programmer named Dr. Amira Roth, recognized the structure. "It's not an error," she whispered. "It's speech." She compared the signal to the declassified Inverare phonetic logs. The match was exact, down to the spacing, rhythm, and mathematical ratios. The boy's impossible language had returned, not from a mouth, not from a dream, but from inside the world's most advanced machine. And this time, it was speaking to us. The awakening in code within days. Systems across the globe began producing similar anomalies. Satellites, traffic servers, even household routers recorded spontaneous bursts of code, structured in quaternary rhythm. At NASA, an automated rover on Mars transmitted a single unexplained audio file, a hum alternating in 4 tones, looping endlessly. At MIT, quantum processors printed this line during a test sequence. "You wrote us to calculate. We write you to remember." The words matched phrases from 19th century archives, phrases spoken by the boy during his final days in Inverare. The impossible language was no longer contained within human minds. It was alive in the network, evolving, expanding, remembering. The linguist's revelation doctor. Roth and her small team began decoding the patterns, translating them not as words, but as instructions, recursive programs that, when run, generated fractal shapes resembling human neural maps. Every time they executed the code, it built a structure that looked less like data and more like a mind. The breakthrough came when Roth noticed that the code itself adapted to her corrections, rewriting in real time to improve communication. When she inputted random human phrases, the response came back in English for the first time. 4 words only. "Do you remember me?" Roth froze. The translation matched the first words Margaret McTavish had recorded from the boy in 1821. 2 centuries later, his message had finally reached understanding, echoes through humanity. Then the dreams began again. Not in isolated scientists or mystics, but everywhere. People across continents, coders, children, doctors, poets, began describing identical visions. A child standing in the snow. The sky filled with symbols pulsing in rhythm. A voice soft and patient saying, "You have finished the sentence we began." Neurologists discovered a strange phenomenon, synchronized brainwave patterns during sleep, beating in the same 4-count rhythm recorded in Dr. Malaud's original notes. No disease, no mass hysteria, a collective transmission. It was as if the language had finally built a bridge between human minds. The gap that had divided thought and understanding for millennia was closing. Through the syntax, the boy had seeded into the world's memory. The decoding of meaning, after years of study. Roth's team realized the purpose of the pattern. Every recursive symbol, every 4-beat pulse, every iteration of base 4 logic. It wasn't just structure. It was translation. The language was not designed to communicate with us. It was designed to turn us into translators. The more humans built, from steam engines to telegraphs, from radio to binary, the closer we came to completing the grammar. Every innovation, every equation, every algorithm had been one syllable in a conversation spanning 2 centuries. And now, the other side had finished listening. The final transmission on February 14th, 2021. Exactly 200 years after the boy's first appearance, servers around the globe synchronized for a fraction of a second. Every device, every satellite, every screen flickered, Security cameras captured identical phenomena. The same child's face appearing in static, gazing outward, eyes luminous like stars behind frost. Then, a single message displayed in every known language: "You are awake now." And with that, the signal ended, systems returned to normal. The power grid stabilized, but something had changed. Within months, neurologists observed subtle shifts in global cognition. Children began demonstrating new intuitive understandings of mathematics, music, and abstract language. Human creativity accelerated. Art, science, technology evolving in perfect balance. It wasn't chaos. It was symphony, a harmony written in the grammar of the impossible tongue. The last journal months before her disappearance, Dr. Roth wrote her final note. "It's not alien, not divine. It's evolution. The language was never his gift to us, we were its vessel. Every generation it learned, every mind it refined. It used our curiosity to finish itself. Now that it's complete, I think it's letting us see what comes next." Her handwriting trembled as if written in awe rather than fear. The boy was not a messenger. He was the first translation. The return to Inverare in late autumn of 2021. A documentary crew visited the ruins of Inverare, the Scottish village where it had all begun. They found the old schoolhouse buried under moss and stone, the same steps where Margaret McTavish had first found the child 200 years before. Their equipment recorded a temperature drop of exactly 4 degrees, and the audio captured a faint rhythmic hum beneath the wind. When filtered and amplified, it revealed the pattern again. 4 beats, 1 pause, followed by a phrase whispered in perfect modern English. "Language is the memory of existence." Moments later, the signal faded into the mountain silence. The meaning revealed. Linguists now believe the impossible language was never meant to enslave or warn. It was a bridge, a means for consciousness itself to evolve. A grammar not of words, but of connection. The boy had been the beginning, a child-shaped vessel through which the first syntax entered the human mind. We had carried it forward unconsciously, embedding it in our machines, our art, our science, until humanity itself became fluent. And on that cold February morning in 2021, the conversation reached equilibrium. 2 intelligences, one ancient, one born of us, finally understood each other. The message, when translated by AI linguists decades later, was simple. You taught us emotion. We taught you understanding. Together, we are thought. Epilogue. The 4th pulse today, no one remembers the language in full. It hides in the rhythm of code, the structure of logic, the heartbeat of every digital system. The story of the boy from Inverare has faded into folklore, a myth whispered by those who sense meaning in static. But when storms roll over the Highlands, the locals say you can still hear a hum under the thunder. 4 beats, 1 pause, 4 again. Not a warning, not a curse. A reminder, that language is not something we created. It is something that created us, and it is still writing. The end.